In the Jordan Valley, under a mound called Tel es Sultan, a stone tower rises 8.5 meters out of the ground, built around 8300 BCE and out of use by roughly 7800 BCE. The settlement around it covered somewhere between 2.5 and 4 hectares and held perhaps 200 to 300 people, a figure closer to a village than to a town. Archaeologists estimate the tower and its wall took roughly 100 people more than 100 days. No pottery, no metal, no wheel, no written sign anywhere on Earth for another 5,000 years. Those few hundred villagers still raised the tallest stone structure any human had put up, and it held that record for millennia. The ordinary thing here is not the tower. It is the question the tower forces, and that question sits under every street you have walked down. The obvious version, which place on Earth was the first city, is the wrong one. The better version changes how you look at your own pavement and your own water bill. The real question is what changed when human beings first outgrew the number of people a single mind can hold. Archaeology does not dig up cities, it digs up the machinery. 3,000 years pass after that tower goes up, and almost nothing on those plains grows any bigger. Across northern Mesopotamia, the villages of the Ubaid period seldom pushed past a single hectare. Arpatia, east of Nineveh, covered roughly half a hectare, possibly no more than 1 or 2 dwellings. That is the size at which every face is known, and every obligation is remembered by someone, without ever being written down anywhere. It is also the size at which the most valuable projects stay out of reach. Irrigation is the clearest case. When canals spread from Chogamami around 4700 to 4600 BCE, they demand the first sustained coordination of labor beyond a single household. A channel has to be cut by people who will not all farm the same field. It has to be cleared of silt at the end of every season, whether or not the water reached a particular family that year. It has to be shared out in an order that nobody personally owns. The return is enormous. Grain in a place with far too little rainfall to grow it any other way. The price is a set of promises that must hold between people who do not know each other and never will. What these villages lack is not labor and not ambition, it is machinery. By the close of the Ubaid period, Eridu held between 2,000 and 4,000 people on no more than 10 hectares. Beneath its main sanctuary, excavators counted 18 temples, built one on top of another. That stacking is the signature of the whole problem. People rebuilt on the exact footprint of whatever had stood there before, generation after generation, until the ground itself rose into an artificial hill. Archaeologists call a mound like that a tell. Jericho contains 29 phases of occupation. Each one solved the same problem at the same scale, and then stopped there. The definition of a city that most people still carry around was written in 1950. A city is not a threshold buried in the ground waiting for a spade to strike it. It is a checklist, and one man drew it up. Vere Gordon Childe published 10 criteria in the Town Planning Review that year, and they have organized the argument about early cities ever since. Childe called the criteria abstract, and he opened the paper by admitting that the notion of a city is notoriously hard to define. By page 16, he conceded something sharper. No specific element of town planning could be proved characteristic of all the early cities he was describing. The list was built as a tool for comparison, and it hardened into a gate. Childe himself would not have called it a gate. Çatalhöyük does not pass through it. The East Mound in central Anatolia covers 13.5 hectares, stands 21 meters high, and held between 3,500 and 8,000 people in any single phase. That is at least 10 times the crowd at Jericho, on a footprint roughly 4 times as large. 2 long excavation programs, one in the 1960s and one running from 1993 to 2017, produced the record. It shows no public buildings and no industrial quarter. No cemetery stands apart from the living, because the dead were buried under the floors of the houses. There is no evidence of internal specialization, no sign that one household did one job and traded for everything else that it needed to live. There is not a single street. The houses were packed wall against wall, and people crossed the settlement over the rooftops and dropped into their own homes through holes cut in the ceiling. The place ran that way for roughly 12 centuries, from about 7100 to 5950 BCE. A settlement of 8,000 people can fail to qualify as a city, depending entirely on who is holding the list. Exactly one settlement answers the question cleanly, and it answers for a reason that has nothing to do with being first. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, Uruk in southern Mesopotamia covered around 250 hectares. Population estimates for the late Uruk city range from 40,000 to 80,000 residents. That is nearly 20 times the area of the East Mound, and something like 10 times its people. Size is not why Uruk wins the vote. Uruk wins because Uruk kept books, and its rivals did not. That distinction deserves a moment. Nearly every criterion separating Uruk from Çatalhöyük on Childe's list is a criterion that leaves hard debris behind. Writing leaves tablets, specialists leave workshops, and monumental buildings leave foundations under the sand. Whatever a settlement organized without producing durable rubbish stays invisible to the method. A method that can see only one kind of order will keep reporting that only one kind of order ever existed. Absence of tablets is not absence of coordination. The north settles it. Tel Brak sits in what is now northeastern Syria, a mound 60 hectares across and 40 meters high. Excavators working at the site found monumental construction, workshops running at industrial scale, and prestige goods already in place by the late 5th millennium BCE. That is several centuries before the Uruk expansion, and several hundred kilometers north of where the standard account draws its starting line. The team publishing those results argued that the old model of a southern core feeding a northern periphery is now ready for a full revision. The question in the title is not broken because the data ran out. It is broken because it assumes a first exists to be found, and the figures that make Uruk look enormous were never counted by anyone. They were calculated. The calculation has a soft spot right in the middle of it. Every population figure for every prehistoric city on Earth is a multiplication, and one of the two numbers being multiplied is a guess. The first number is the area, measured in hectares from survey maps and geophysical plans, and that number is usually solid enough to trust. The second is a density coefficient. It states how many people 1 hectare of that kind of settlement is assumed to have held. Susan McIntosh worked with a coefficient reaching 195 people per hectare for the West African city of Jenné-jeno, and a coefficient of that kind is chosen, not measured. Raise or lower a figure like that by half, and the answer moves by thousands. No new object has to come out of the ground for it to happen. Nobody can check a coefficient against a census, because there was never a census to check it against. The effect shows up most clearly wherever two teams have worked the same site. For Jericho during the pre-pottery Neolithic, one set of published estimates puts the population of the settlement at 200 to 300 people. Other published estimates put it at 2,000 to 3,000. The two ranges do not overlap at any point. That is a tenfold gap on one settlement in one archaeological phase. Even the area is unsettled, quoted at 2.5 hectares in some accounts and 4 hectares in others. More evidence does not close a gap like that in the way it should. Clark Spencer Larsen and his colleagues published a study of 742 human skeletons from Çatalhöyük in 2019. That is one of the largest samples ever assembled from a Neolithic settlement. It supported detailed conclusions about diet, about disease, about workload, and about the injuries that people in that community carried through their lives. The population figure stayed a range running from 3,500 to 8,000, wide enough to describe two entirely different kinds of society. The softness is not lying in the ground waiting to be excavated. It sits in the method. The place most likely to hold the answer is the one place that cannot be dug. Southern Mesopotamia is a floodplain, and the alluvial plain there has been quietly burying its own past for something like 8,000 years. The earliest settlement anyone has reached down there is Tel el-Kili, dated to roughly 5,500 to 5,400 BC. Specialists say it plainly. Older sites very likely exist, lying hidden under river silt or drowned as the shoreline of the Persian Gulf shifted across the delta. There is no way to test that claim, which is what makes it a barrier rather than a gap. The decisive evidence carries a second problem, and this one is stratigraphic. Between 1928 and 1976, German excavators at Uruk recovered close to 5,000 tablets and fragments of the earliest known script. All of them came from rubbish. None of them sat in secure stratigraphy, and they can be placed only within or below the level called Uruk 3. The chronology of the most important documents in the whole argument rests on pottery sequences. Those sequences sort material into bins roughly 1 to 2 full centuries wide. Uruk Vu runs from about 3500 to 3350 BCE, Uruk 4 from about 3350 to 3200, and Uruk 3 from about 3200 to 3000. The bins are wider than the events inside them. Two settlements separated by 100 years cannot be put in order inside brackets that size. That word has nothing to hold. What is missing here is not an older site, and no future excavation season will supply it. The answerable version of the question is not where, but when human coordination stopped fitting inside human memory. Answering that requires finding the moment somebody built a memory that sits outside the head. Nothing of the kind existed yet. The most consequential record-keeping system in human history arrives as a trick for avoiding the need to smash a small ball of clay open. From roughly 8000 BC, people across the Near East counted with small clay tokens of set shapes. 3 jars of oil meant 3 ovoid tokens, 1 token for each jar. The system ran on one-to-one correspondence, and it solved the problem of remembering who owed what to whom. After about 3500 BC, a second layer appears. Tokens for what somebody owed were sealed inside a hollow ball of clay, and the ball was marked with the seals of officials. Archaeologists call one of those clay balls a bulla. It fixed the problem of a debt that 2 parties remembered differently, and it created a new one immediately. Nobody could check the contents without breaking the ball, which destroyed the record. The third patch is the one that mattered. Before enclosing the tokens, an accountant pressed each one into the soft outer surface of the ball of clay. A cone left a wedge, and a disc left a circle, and the account could be read with the seal untouched. The fourth patch is laziness. The ball gets flattened into a slab, and the tokens stop being made at all. A sealed clay envelope from Susa dates to around 3300 BCE, and impressed tablets follow at roughly 3200 and 3100 BCE. The earliest signs on those tablets depict the things that needed counting, among them grain, fish, and animals. No participant left an account of this, and the sequence above is the best reconstruction the evidence supports. A method for counting sheep had been sitting in these communities for something like 4,000 years. It turned into a method for holding language only after settlements grew past a certain size, and the clay itself explains none of that. Nobody invented writing. Accountants dodged a chore. Something new existed. Why did a counting system that already existed take 4,000 years to turn into writing? The tokens were there the whole time, sitting in the same villages, doing the same job. Across the Ubaid period, which runs from roughly 6500 to 3800 BCE, settlement size on the plains barely moves. Most places stay under a single hectare. A community of 200 or 300 people does not need a filing system, because it already has one. Every creditor knows every debtor by sight. Every obligation is witnessed by neighbors who will still be neighbors in 10 years. Reputation does the enforcement. A village can lose a record and rebuild it from conversation over a single evening. At that scale, the clay is a convenience rather than an infrastructure. There is also a hard limit built into the tokens themselves. Each type of good had its own token shape, so that jars of oil could be counted only with ovoid tokens and measures of grain only with cones. Specialists describe that arrangement as concrete counting, meaning the number and the thing counted are welded together and cannot be pulled apart. Under concrete counting, there is no way to write 4 without writing 4 of something. A new commodity demands a new shape. The system therefore grows sideways rather than upward, adding shapes instead of adding power, and it can run in that condition indefinitely. It ran for something like 4,500 years. The shape of the problem never changed across those 45 centuries, and neither did the shape of the answer that people kept giving it. It could have been pressed flat into a tablet at any point in that span. Nothing forced the change. Nobody did it, and nobody recorded why not. The capacity sat available and unused for longer than the whole span from the first tablet to the present day. Then, inside roughly 2 centuries, one society starts producing paperwork faster than it produces anything else. Around 6,000 tablets survive from the world of late 4th millennium Uruk. carrying more than 38,000 lines of text between them. Specialists call this script proto-cuneiform, meaning the stage of signs that comes before wedge-shaped writing proper, and still works purely as bookkeeping. Not one line of it is literature. There are no myths, no letters, no laws, and no prayers. There are quantities, commodities, deliveries, and totals, and the name of whoever the account belonged to. Nothing in the earliest corpus records a decision, a boast, or a single event that anybody thought worth remembering. Bookkeeping arrived before poetry. The order of arrival carries the argument, because it shows which pressure came first. The same tablets turn up beyond Uruk itself, at Jemdet Nasser, Kafaja, and Tel Ukair. The method traveled as a package, not as a rumor. Within a few generations, the sign list expands sharply, the strokes get shorter and straighter, and formatting conventions appear on the clay. That is a bureaucracy revising its own forms. The physical record of that society points the same way. The commonest object at Uruk sites is a crude, thick-walled, mold-made bowl with a beveled rim, and archaeologists call it a bevel rim bowl. It accounts for roughly 3/4 of all pottery recovered from Uruk culture settlements, and hundreds of thousands of them have been found. Experimental work by Jill Golder in 2010 tested them as bread molds and produced loaves of 1/2 liter to 1 liter, the size of a working ration. The most mass-produced object of the first urban culture on Earth was a container for paying somebody. Scribes rolled cylinder seals across the entire surface of a tablet before impressing the figures, so that any later alteration would break the pattern. What appears above the threshold is not art and not law. It is an apparatus for handling strangers. There is a famous number for this limit, and it does not survive contact with the data. This is the part worth slowing down for. Robin Dunbar proposed that a person can maintain roughly 150 stable relationships, a figure extrapolated from a regression line relating relative neocortex size to group size across primates. The number escaped into general circulation and stayed there. The Swedish Tax Authority restructured its offices to keep each one under the 150-person ceiling. In 2021, Patrick Lindenfors, Andreas Wartel, and Johan Lind reran the original analysis in biology letters, using updated primate brain data and modern phylogenetic methods. Bayesian methods returned average group sizes between 69 and 109. Generalized least squares returned between 16 and 42. The 95% confidence intervals ran from 3.8 to 526.0 and from 2.1 to 336.3. Restricting the sample to monkeys and apes moved the estimate to 404.1, with an interval running from 300.6 to 543.3. The estimates are averages, not ceilings. An upper bound would have to come from the top of the confidence interval, and the top of that interval sits at 520 people. Those are not 4 rival answers. They are one method failing 4 times, and the authors say so directly, concluding that a cognitive ceiling on human group size cannot be derived in this way. None of that makes the threshold imaginary. It makes the threshold unmeasured. That is the honest position here. What the archaeology shows is a change of state, not a figure that can be checked against a brain. The regime change is observable, sitting in the ground as tablets and seals and standardized bowls that appear where nothing of the kind existed before. The value at which it trips is not observable at all. Nobody can say how many neighbors it takes. The death of the token system took about 1/20th as long as its life. After 4,500 years of use, tokens decline and vanish from the record between roughly 3,100 and 3,000 BC. The mechanism behind that collapse is small and total. As long as an accountant impressed 1 mark for each item, the mark stayed welded to the objects, and 11 sheep meant 11 impressions. Once one sign carried the quantity, and a separate sign carried the commodity, the number came loose from the thing being numbered. Abstract number exists at that moment. The clay counters become redundant in the same stroke, because a numeral can do what a bag of shapes used to do, and can do it for any commodity at all. The bag of shapes was never replaced by a better bag. The next change follows the same logic and reaches further. Around 3000 BC, signs standing for sounds enter the system, introduced to transcribe the names of individual people, because an account of who owes what is useless without the who. Writing begins imitating speech at that point, And once it can imitate speech, it stops being restricted to grain and cattle. Nothing about that was planned. The whole sequence is invisible while it runs, because every step looks like a small saving of effort to the person taking it. Look at what the surviving evidence is made of before you decide what a city is. It is not monuments and not king lists. It is the residue of an accounting problem that outgrew the people trying to hold it in their heads. Tax rolls, census returns, and property registers all descend from that same reflex. A settlement can now outlive the memory of everyone inside it. Obligations survive their witnesses. Strangers become countable. Something new exists. The largest settlements in 4th millennium Europe had no palace, no temple precinct, and no writing of any kind. They sit in the forest steppe of central Ukraine and belong to the Trypillia culture, which spread across roughly 200,000 square kilometers of what is now Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Geophysical Survey has produced one complete plan so far, of a site called Nebelivka, occupied between about 3970 and 3770 BC. It covers 238 hectares inside a shallow perimeter ditch. 4 other sites in the same group run larger still, with Taljanki reaching 340 hectares, Dobrovody 250, and Maidanetske 200. The plan is not a sprawl. Houses stand in multiple concentric circuits, separated by wide bands of empty ground, with radial streets running inward toward an open central space. Nothing was built in that center. A settlement of that size with an empty middle is the opposite of every layout that later cities would adopt. Nebelivka alone held 1,445 structures. Of those, 1,077 had been burnt, and the burning was deliberate rather than accidental. Experimental reconstruction showed that a Trypillia house will not burn down to the state found in the ground unless it is packed with far more dry timber than went into building it. Somebody carried fuel in so that a house would be destroyed properly. Then comes the part that has not been settled. A pollen core taken beside the site records only modest human impact on the surrounding landscape, which does not match thousands of houses occupied at the same time. 3 models now compete to explain the mismatch. One treats the site as permanently occupied under distributed governance. One treats it as a seasonal assembly ground, and one as a pilgrimage center visited in rotation. None of the 3 has won. The largest thing in Europe is still an argument. 800 years later and 3,000 kilometers east, a different civilization is standardizing its bricks. Mohenjo-daro sits on the Indus floodplain and belongs to a network of at least 1,500 known Harappan sites spread across the northwest of the subcontinent. Its baked bricks follow a fixed ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 in thickness, width, and length. A common brick measures close to 28 by 14 by 7 centimeters. That ratio holds at sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. Holding it requires either a shared mold tradition or a shared instruction, and both of those imply coordination across an enormous area. The measuring equipment matches the bricks. An ivory scale recovered at the site is graduated with a smallest division of about 1.7 millimeters. Cubical stone weights turn up in matched sets at site after site. Streets run on a grid aligned north to south and east to west. Covered brick drains run beneath those streets, fed by smaller drains inside individual houses. The one building that plausibly served ritual is a great bath of tightly fitted, waterproofed brick. Grain stores point to a food supply that somebody was managing on behalf of everyone else. Somebody was regulating production. This is a civilization that solved sanitation before most of the world had solved roofing. And then the absences begin. No structure has been securely identified as a palace. No royal tomb has been found, and burials are simple pit graves with modest goods. There is no monumental sculpture at all, and the largest human figures known from the site stand under 20 centimeters. Harappan beads and seals have been recovered as far away as and Susa, so this was not an isolated pocket. The seals carry a script that remains undeciphered. The one early civilization that clearly wrote things down cannot tell anybody what it was doing. At almost the same moment, on the desert coast of Peru, people were raising pyramids without owning a single pot. Caral lies in the Soup Valley, 23 kilometers inland from the Pacific. Radiocarbon dates published in Science in 2001 by Ruth Shady Solís, Jonathan Haas, and Winifred Creamer place monumental construction, urban settlement, and irrigation agriculture there between 2627 and 1977, calibrated BC. The dates came from an unusual source. Builders filled reed bags with stone and used the bags themselves as structural fill inside the platforms, and those bags are ideal material for high-precision dating. A wall was radiocarbon dated because of how it had been packed. 20 radiocarbon measurements describe continuous occupation across roughly 600 years, which rules out a brief ceremonial episode and leaves a functioning settlement. Nothing about it is provisional. The central zone covers 65 hectares and carries 6 large platform mounds, along with sunken circular plazas. Caral is one of 18 large pre-ceramic sites in the same valley, so the pattern is regional rather than singular. The word pre-ceramic is doing heavy work in that sentence. These communities had no pottery, which removes the storage and cooking technology that almost every account of early civilization treats as a prerequisite. Not one sherd has come out of the pre-ceramic levels. They also had no staple grain crop of the kind that fed Mesopotamia. The valley is one of the driest coastal deserts on Earth, and the fields ran on irrigation drawn from the Supe River. The economy ran on cotton and fish. Cotton was grown inland and worked into nets, and the nets went to the coast in exchange for the catch those nets brought in. 2 settlements, 2 products, 1 loop. No fortifications have been found for the period, and no weapons, and no burned buildings. Everything the standard model treats as the engine of urban life is absent here, and the pyramids went up anyway. Move to the floodplain of the Middle Niger, and the pattern changes shape again. Jenné-jeno, in what is now Mali, was founded around the 3rd century BC by iron-using people who fished, herded stock, and grew rice, and it kept growing for more than 1,000 years. It was the first indigenous city recognized anywhere in Africa south of the Sahara, which overturned a standing assumption that urban life there had been imported across the desert. The main mound reached 33 hectares. By itself, that sounds like a large town rather than a city. The main mound is not the unit. Jenné-jeno sat at the center of a tight cluster of separate settlement mounds, and one count puts 12 of them together at 51.2 hectares of occupied ground. The satellites were physically bounded and physically separate. Different mounds specialized in different crafts and different ways of getting food, while each kept its own autonomy. Craft debris differs from mound to mound, with iron working concentrated in one place and pottery in another. The boundaries between them were maintained rather than dissolved. The cluster pattern is the finding here, because a city built as a ring of separate and autonomous settlements does not appear anywhere in the standard sequence of urban forms. Population depends entirely on the coefficient chosen, and Susan McIntosh worked with figures reaching 195 people per hectare, which is the same soft multiplication described earlier. What is not soft is the absence. A century of excavation has produced no evidence of kings, no state apparatus, and no detectable ranking through the first millennium of occupation. The excavators argued that power here was distributed sideways among corporate groups rather than stacked upward, and specialists call that arrangement heterarchy, meaning authority spread laterally instead of gathered at a summit. They described the result as a city without a citadel. Occupation shrank after about AD 900, and the site was abandoned within a few centuries. The last case has no writing, no wheel, no draft animals, and no metal tools, and it built the largest earthwork in the Americas north of Mexico. Cahokia stood on the Mississippi floodplain near modern St. Louis, occupied mainly between 800 and 1400 CE. Around 1050, the settlement changed state inside what looks in the ground like a single generation, an episode archaeologists call the Mississippian Big Bang. At its height between 1050 and 1150, it covered nearly 1,600 hectares and carried some 120 mounds, with population estimates running from 10,000 to 20,000 people. That made it larger than London at the same date. Monk's Mound rises 30 meters in 4 terraces and covers more than 5 hectares at the base. The Grand Plaza at its foot, roughly 16 hectares of ground, was leveled and graded in one coordinated operation. Every cubic meter of that came up in baskets carried on human backs, and the total volume has been estimated in the region of 600,000 cubic meters. Nothing survives that resembles a tablet, a seal, or a standardized ration container. Whatever held that labor together was made of speech, ceremony, and memory. None of those fossilize. The absence of an archive here is not evidence of an absent administration. Decline set in after about 1250, and the place was empty by roughly 1350, and nobody there wrote a word about any of it. 5 places, on 4 continents, separated by up to 7,000 years. Different crops, different building materials, different climates, different answers about who gets to give orders. Not one of them knew the other 4 existed. Every one of them arrived at the same requirement, which is a way of keeping order among people who will never know each other by name. The requirement is the constant, the apparatus is the variable, and the price of running it has not been mentioned yet. What the first cities exported was not architecture. Mesopotamian labor was paid in measured issues of barley and oil. Ignace Gelb documented the arrangement in 1965, and it has been called the ration system ever since. A ration is a promise made portable. It lets an administration hire a stranger for a season without knowing his family, his village, or his reputation. The obligation is discharged in units rather than in trust. An administration that can hire strangers, pay them in units, and record the transaction has solved the problem that kept every earlier village pinned to a single hectare. That trick travels, and the record shows it traveling as a complete kit rather than as an inspiration. In what is now southwestern Iran, a related script appears at only 5 sites, and the resemblance runs deeper than the signs. The tablet blanks are the same. The method of inscribing them is the same. Even the convention of reserving the reverse of the tablet for the summation is the same. The purpose is identical, which is administrative accounting inside a centrally controlled society. Trade does not explain that. Nobody borrows a filing convention as a fashion. They borrow it because they have acquired the same problem. The material culture spread on the same current. Buildings in the Uruk style went up in urban settlements across Syria and southern Turkey. Objects made under Mesopotamian influence turn up from central Iran to the Nile Delta until around 3000 BC. The endpoint of that line is the one everybody knows. Signs eventually shed their pictures and stood for sounds, and the alphabet reduced the whole system to roughly 24 letters, each carrying a single sound of the voice. Every step in that chain made the apparatus lighter, cheaper, and easier to copy. None of the steps made it optional. The medical record of the most crowded Neolithic settlement in the world reads like an emergency intake sheet. This one is worth taking slowly. Clark Spencer Larsen and an international team published their analysis of 742 individuals from Çatalhöyük in 2019, covering the whole occupation from 7100 to 5950 Cal BCE. Up to a third of the remains from the earliest period carry evidence of infection on the bone itself. Bone involvement is the stage an infection reaches only after it has been present a long time. Between 10 and 13% of adult teeth show cavities, a signature of a diet leaning heavily on stored cereal. The most direct finding came from the skulls. In a sample of 93 crania, 25 individuals carried healed depressed fractures. 12 of them had been struck on more than one occasion, with between 2 and 5 separate injuries over the course of a life. 13 of the victims were women, and 10 were men. The wounds cluster on the top and the back of the skull, which means the people struck were not facing whoever hit them. The shape of the lesions matches a hard, round object, and hardened clay balls of exactly that size have been recovered in quantity from inside the houses. The match is suggestive, not proven. The frequency of these injuries rises in the middle period, when the population was at its largest and most densely packed. Leg bone cross-sections tell the last part. People in the late period were walking significantly further than their ancestors had, because the fields and the firewood had retreated from the settlement. Every one of those figures describes a person who went on living in the same houses, on the same roofs, beside whoever had done it. Then everybody left. Nothing replaced it there. The picture is unusually clean for something 9,000 years old, and a clean picture is the point at which a careful person starts asking what the evidence cannot show. 3 claims in this story deserve to be held at arm's length, and the first 2 are wrong. Jericho and Çatalhöyük are routinely called the oldest cities on Earth, and neither of them clears the checklist that the title is being awarded from. Çatalhöyük has no public buildings, no separate cemetery, and no streets. Jericho held a few hundred people behind a wall and a tower. Calling either a city stretches the word past the point where it distinguishes anything. The second claim is that urban life was invented once and spread. 5 independent cases have already dismantled that, and the evidence from northern Mesopotamia finishes it. Sites including Hamokar, Tepe-Gara, and Arslan-Tepe show the same trajectory running in parallel with the south rather than downstream from it. Nobody exported the city. Several populations arrived at it separately, under different pressures, using different materials. The label carries a cost. A checklist built from one region turns every other region into a near miss. Trypillia becomes a puzzle to be solved rather than a settlement to be understood, and Jenné-jeno becomes an exception to a rule rather than a city in its own right. Cahokia becomes a mound complex rather than a place where 20,000 people lived. Each of those is an answer to the same problem, reached without a template, and ranking them requires a ruler that none of them would recognize. Comparison without a podium is the honest position. The question is not which one came first, but which pressure they were all under. The third item is not a myth at all, and it is the reason to keep a grip on the first two. A great deal about these places is unknown, and the reasons are specific rather than vague, starting with the fact that population figures remain a multiplication with a chosen number inside them. The Indus script has never been read, which means the best documented early city cannot describe itself. The 3 competing accounts of the Ukrainian megasites are still competing, and no new evidence has yet arrived to separate them from one another. The oldest levels in southern Mesopotamia lie under river silt that nobody can lift. Even the Çatalhöyük team declined to close their own case. They reported the injuries and noted the link between crowding and violence elsewhere. Then they wrote that the variation in trauma at their own site is not explained by crowding alone. That sentence is the model. When you meet a confident answer about the first city, the useful thing to ask is which coefficient it used and which layer it could not reach. The uncertainty here is not a gap in the story. It is the story. Stand still for a moment and look down at the ground under your feet. Somewhere below it runs a pipe. That pipe runs to a treatment plant, and the plant bills you by a unit somebody had to define. That is a record. The building above has a number on it, chosen so that a stranger can find you without knowing anything else. That is a record. The lease, the meter reading, the payslip, the receipt from a shop where nobody knew your name and nobody needed to. Every one of those is a record as well. The postcode itself is a sorting device, built so that strangers can be grouped and counted. The bricks in the nearest wall match the bricks in the wall behind it, because a mold enforced a ratio. The curb outside sits at a height agreed by people who will never meet you. The bus that arrives at a stated minute is a promise between strangers, kept by a system that counts. The queue at any counter runs on the same principle, which is order among people with no shared history. None of it depends on anyone in that street knowing anyone else in that street. Every one of those things is a device for holding an obligation steady between people who cannot vouch for each other by sight. The apparatus is still running. None of this is a comparison. It is not a metaphor drawn from the clay. It is the same operation, running without interruption, in different materials. The pipe under the street and the drain under Mohenjo-daro are one solution to one piece of arithmetic. The receipt in the pocket and the sealed ball of clay from Susa are the same object with 50 centuries of drift between them. Every one of the 5 places in this story built some version of that machinery, and only 2 of them left anything a spade can read. The line was never cut. Nobody ever stood at the end of the ancient part and started the modern part. There is no seam anywhere along it. At the start of the whole thing, before the tablets, before the cities, before the word city existed to be argued over, there is one accountant. Nobody recorded that person's name, and nobody drew that person's face. The hands are holding a soft ball of clay with somebody's debt sealed inside it. The contents have to be checked without breaking the seal, so the tokens go into the outer surface, one at a time, until the marks show what the inside holds. Nobody there is inventing writing, and nobody there is founding a civilization. Nobody there is thinking about the street you are standing on, or the pipe beneath it, or the number on the door behind you. Somebody is solving a small problem at the end of a working day, in a settlement that would fail every test on Child's list. The clay dried, the account held, and everything else came out of that.